Okay, I now call on our Chair of the Day, Branko Penic, to take over the meeting and further introduce our guest speaker. Thanks, Pen.
Thanks, President Phillip. It's my honour to introduce our guest speaker today, Alan Oster. This is a particularly easy job because everyone knows who Alan Oster is. Very well known and regarded former Chief Economist of the NAB. Alan did that role for 33 years and was extremely well known in Australian business circles for being the leader of that economic function. In that role, he was responsible for NAB's local and global economics and financial markets forecasts. Through that role, he also helped develop and lead the much-watched monthly business survey and a number of other tools that were then shared across industry with RBA, government and other institutions, including ABS. But what many people may not know is prior to that, Alan had a distinguished career in government and spent many years, in fact 15 years, with Treasury, including the role of senior advisor, an SES level position, responsible for the Commonwealth Treasury's forecasting and modelling areas. So, as such, Alan's had a very widely held reputation as an expert in economic forecasting and monetary policy issues. Finally, he's well-respected commentator on economic issues, both public and private, and much sought out privately for his advice and suggestions on policy issues. Having retired from the bank in May of last year, Alan is now pursuing new opportunities, including consulting and advisory activities, and happy to look at other things that come his way, I'm sure. Please welcome Alan Oster.
Thanks, Branko. I'm going to do something different. I've got a pack of about 30 slides, and you can have it after I'm finished. All right? So I'm just going to talk. I'm sort of going to talk for, 15 minutes, and then 15 minutes you guys can fire whatever you like at me. First thing I'd start off by saying is no one knows exactly what's going to happen. That's pretty obvious. There's always been times where in the past it's been tricky. I'm not sure it's been more tricky than what it is now because you've got to make assumptions about what is going to happen in terms of wars, what's going to happen in terms of Trump with still trying to interfere with the Federal Reserve. When I look back at my career, and Branko was kind enough just to sort of highlight, I've been basically doing forecasts for about 40 years. And I think there's a few things that are different these days and a few things that are the same. The things that are different is the access to data. So we can now, or NAB, you can now every Wednesday say what happened to any transaction that went across their systems as of last Saturday, including people's unemployment status and where they're getting money. So that gives you a lot more sort of information. The things that have not changed is the importance of businesses' confidence and consumers' confidence. And unfortunately, that's not always rational. You can get really strange behaviour out of consumers who get scared. And if they get scared, they'll take actions that will actually have real life impacts. And they're the ones at present that are the most important. And roughly what you say is you can work out on the past what sort of happens if certain things happen. But if the consumer behaves differently to what happened in the past, you'll get a very different result. And the other rough rule is you work out the direct effects and double it because there's indirect effects there that you just don't know. Okay, so I'm going to start off by just trying to give you some feelings about what, if I was running the forecasting modellings in Treasury or the NAB ones, what we'd be looking at. And so obviously the number one thing today is beyond Trump, oil prices. And what's the mechanism of how it affects the economy? And what's really important is timing. So what you get, number one, in the Australian situation anyway, it's the same in America, basically about 3% of the CPI is petrol. So if petrol goes up 40%, the price, you have an impact straight away. And so you've got a big increase in the CPI that came out today. The actual your headlines are 4.6 for headline, which is actually going to be written off probably as terrible, but actually market economists and the markets thought it was going to be 4.8. So it's actually less than what we thought. And then you look at what you might think of core inflation, which actually didn't change. So 3.3. Now, from an Australian point of view, that's different to what's happening globally because we've got a higher inflation rate than what globally is typical. So the US, you're talking about 3% inflation. You're talking a cash rate of about 3.5. So the other thing that you need to know is in some economies, they're more exposed to oil than others. So if you're in Japan, if you're in China, if you're in large chunks of Europe, you're completely exposed. Australia and the US are different because, number one, we and the US are both exporters of energy. So for the Australian case, you're going to get a huge amount of money from LNG if you're the government, roughly 10 billion a year. So, the government will probably spend a fair bit of that in a few weeks' time. But that's where you're at. The thing that always occurs is the consumer gets hurt. Now, what I can say to you is it takes 3 to 6 months to come up and show up. And when you get the March quarter GDP, which you'll get in June, it'll have 1 month of that. So it'll have bugger all. But rough rule, 10 cents a litre increase, you take off 0.1 off GDP. Okay. Now we've gone from 170 to 240. So, that's about 0.6. Indirect effects, double it. So for GDP, government was expecting something like, through the course of this year, something like 2.3, 2.5. So I think you're going to be 1.3 to 1.5 max. The budget is a financial year, and so it'll get not a lot in 24, 25, but you'll have impacts on 25, 26. So I would expect the government to put a forecast out there of GDP of around 2. But actually through the course of this year, where it's actually hitting, it's more like 1. Also, you can do your normal sort of relationships between GDP and unemployment. Currently, unemployment's 4.3 in Australia. I would expect it to go to at least 4.8, which might not sound a lot, but it is 100,000 additional people on the dole. Now, looking at the economy, what's really important is the level of unemployment, because there is a lot of stress there. And people always say, oh, yeah, but retirees like you don't have a mortgage and blah, blah, blah. And so it's great when interest rates go up. The third of the economy that have a mortgage have a much bigger hit, and it has a negative impact that's really big. The other thing we see in Australia is the third of the economy that rent are also having a lot of problems. And so you see rental effects, you see cost of livings, etc. And in NAB, when I was there anyway, we used to see a lot of people going to charities, much more than normal. And also, one of the things, I think I've told Branko this story, one of the fastest growths of charitable giving is actually to pay for car registrations. Why? A lot of people are living in their car. And if you don't pay your car rego, you lose your car. So a lot of stress out there. But if you've got a situation where unemployment's not that high, you can sort of spend a little bit less, you can sort of try and get a second job, and you can survive for a while. And that is basically what the consumer's doing out there now. One thing that worries me slightly is that when we look at our business surveys for the March month, it's just come out, there's 2 key measures. One is what's actually happening, and the next question is, what do you think is going to happen? How confident are you? Now, consumers, so the actual results are, well, it's a little bit below long-run average, but it's okay. The reading in business confidence, which I take a lot of notice of, is actually minus 29, but the best way to think about it would be it's the same level of confidence as you saw in the middle of the 1990 recession. People are scared, and that is having a big impact. And what we typically find is that if business is scared, they don't necessarily invest, other than things like AI and etc., data centers, and they don't necessarily employ people. And so that can very quickly get nasty. So I think the government will come out with an unemployment rate that says it's not a recession, but it'll probably feel like a recession to a lot of people. Hopefully, my sort of assumption is the war goes on for another 6 months, or petrol prices do, and then they start to come back, which may or may not happen. If it doesn't happen and it goes longer, all those impacts stay longer and get more nasty. And it's pretty easy to get a recession out of that. But we're not seeing it yet. The other thing you sort of probably expect me to cover is what do we expect in the budget? Now, I've been around budgets a long time, because in terms of NAB, I did 30 or something, and I did about 10 in the Treasury, because the other 4 I was at the OECD looking on. So this is the first time I'm actually not doing budget commentary overnight. If I'm going to look at anything, the thing that I'd look at, and there's a chart in my pack, you've got to be really careful, because they're increasingly stuffing expenditure not on budget but off budget. Okay? So look at the headline, and the headline will be something like $60 billion, which is okay. It's small by American standards. It's small by a lot of countries' standards. But what you get, and you can see it in terms of the way the economy is now moving, if I look at public sector demand as a percent of GDP, and I've got data from 1959, and from 1959 through to about 2020, the average, that's somewhere between 21 and 23%. During COVID, it got to 25. Today, it's 30. Okay? Now, where are they spending the money? 3 main areas. Basically, health, think NDIS. The government's put out some plans where they say the growth rate of this $50 billion a year is now going to be 2% rather than 10. They're going to keep 160,000 people off the scheme. Well, let's wait and see. So it sounds really big, but they've got to, one, get it through Parliament, and two, there'll be a lot of politics involved. But don't worry, in a couple of weeks' time, they'll count it as if it all happened. So you just need to be really careful in that. So NDIS, what they call Social Security and health, they're massive increases. That is the reason why you're at 30% rather than 23. Those 3 areas just happen to be 3 of the worst areas for productivity in Australia, in the short term anyway. So that's a big problem when they say Australia's got a productivity issue. So in very simple terms, think of infrastructure. There's a lot of crowding out. You can't get the cement, et cetera, et cetera. And so that makes it very difficult. And so we then run along at an issue. If I talk then a little bit about interest rates, inflation's gone up, right? But it's gone up for a one-off shock. Oil price. Now, we had a few issues there, essentially because of that demand. Public sector demand was stronger than it normally is. A lot of private sector activity is what's called crowded out. In other words, too hard to get investments, can't make any money, I won't build it, etc. And so those sort of things are important. Our central bank has been one that has been not as aggressive as most others, and I've had a lot of sympathy for that. We've now got a central bank that, probably shouldn't say this publicly, but is starting to remind me a little bit of inflation zealotry. So we've had 2 rate hikes in essentially February and March, and they're talking about another one next week. Now, if they do another one, remember, it takes at least 6 to 12 months for those impacts of interest rates to come through and show up in the economy. So if you're in a situation where the economy is going to be clobbered by oil and you've got 3 rate rises, you've got a problem. And so I would say, I hope in the old days, I used to have to say, well, this is what I think they'll do, but I think it's wrong. So I hope they don't do anything, and the slower inflation than expected is helpful. and you don't know. But what I would say is if they go next week, they'll probably have to cut by the end of the year. So I think it's a real potential mistake. But you in the real world have to basically factor in the idea that that could well go. I think it's, before I came into the room, it was 75% chance of a rate hike next week. And there's a lot of people out there saying, well, if they don't do it, they're letting inflation get away. That's not true. What they're trying to do is make sure inflationary expectations don't get unenacted. In other words, in layman's terms, you don't see those higher inflation showing up in bigger increases in wages. Okay, so I'm a bit sceptical. There's a lot of other things that I cover in the slide back about what might they do. I don't have a big problem with them extending, if they extend the 25 cents cut in fuel excise, because that's just trying to get rid of some of the consumer effects that I was talking about. The other thing they talk about is capital gains tax, the discount. I don't have a problem with the idea, there's a 50% discount, so, you get a $100,000 profit on your sale. The tax office treats it as $50,000. Why? Because they thought it was all too difficult to get the house prices index properly. These days, that's really simple. I don't have an issue either with the idea that, I don't know whether this will happen or not, negative gearing. I don't think negative gearing is a big issue. Done a lot of modelling in my time on negative gearing, particularly in a bank, and we were getting very small. But, they're saying maybe you're limited to 2. So I wouldn't expect the budget to do a lot to house prices. It might, if I had to guess, I'd say 3 or 4% one-off. And also depends on grandfathering as well. So, if you've got an existing asset, do you treat it in the new form, or do you only treat new assets that you've purchased in the new format? I'm assuming they'll grandfather it. Otherwise, that would be difficult. But again, I'd go back to the budget and say the main thing I'd suggest you look at is the headline and look at that debt to, or public sector demand to GDP. The final thing that everyone always wants to know about is house prices. My sort of assumptions on house prices, I think the main message in Australia is be aware there's a lot of differences in terms of the various states. So when I used to work at the OECD in Paris, we used to look at the 6 months annualised rate. So you look at the last 6 months and you annualise it. If you're looking at that, Perth and Adelaide are going at about a 30% annualised rate. Melbourne, unfortunately, is going nothing. And Sydney's now going backwards. So it depends on where you are. So I would expect that these increases in rates will take some of the top off the housing market. So I wouldn't expect Sydney and Melbourne to improve much. But over time, I would expect Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth to basically slow down to those sort of rates. So I would basically expect house prices to be increasing 5% in the next couple of years per annum. So I might stop there because I'm running out of time, I think. Generally, what I'm saying is in the short term, we've got a tough situation. It will be tougher than I think you will realise. In the medium term, I'm more optimistic because Australia does have a good education system. It has a good judicial system. And we're sitting in an area that's very exposed to Asia. And this is still the Asian century. So I'm medium-term optimistic. I don't think our politicians are doing us any favours, but I think we'll struggle through it. Branko, I'll stop there. Question?
Thank you, Alan. Now, we do have about 10 minutes for some questions. So we've got roving mic. Adrian.
Hi there, Alan. Adrian Nelson. I'm interested in your views on debt, in particularly government debt. The numbers that it is now is something that people just can't fathom. It's just,
okay,
as it changes.
Okay, so let me give you 2 really simple ways. Then people are now talking about federal debt approaching $1 trillion. Okay, sounds a lot. However, the GDP numbers increase by 2 trillion every year. So our debt to GDP is actually 30%, which is really low. which is why, so America's like 120, Japan's like 300, Greece used to be 200, and we're 30. The state governments have added a lot to it, but when I was in Treasury, I can remember being asked by Keating, are the banks serious? Is Victoria going to go bust? That's back in those days. The answer is no federal government's going to let a state government go bust. And so, offshore people are still buying Victorian paper pretty easily. The Victorians can sell it pretty easily because they say, well, I'm not going to have a debt issue. So Australians' debt as a percent of GDP is also basically pretty good, much better. So if you're going to pick on anyone, you go pick on some of the others, you leave Australia alone. And the other one that I'll probably say, because you hear the same thing, they say all the time that Australian household debt is one of the highest in the world as a percent of GDP. And it is, it's not the highest, but it's right up there. That's gross debt. So net debt, i.e., if I count the assets of the consumer, and they're not just the land, but they're also the holdings of equities, the super funds, etc., we're, I think, number 2 in the world in terms of the bottom behind Japan. So the idea that whenever I used to go to New York and they say, oh, you guys are all about to fall over, they just didn't have that idea that the balance sheet is actually very good in terms of the consumer. But you tell me the unemployment rate suddenly goes to 6, I tell you we're stuffed. All right? So it really matters.
Alan Michael Self. Alan, overseas investment into Australia seems to be quite a topic these days, or it used to be decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing enough to attract overseas investment?
I think we are, in the sense that we've got the good fundamentals. And if you're an overseas investor, you'd basically say, I don't expect to get or double my money in the next couple of years, but I expect to do really well over a 10-year period. And in fact, the money that's coming in is actually quite high at present. So we are attracting, whether we're actually getting the right amounts of benefits in terms of taxpayers is a different issue. Because every big corporate seems to have a hub somewhere in Singapore that basically they get all the money goes up there and gets cleaned up there, or we're not imposing enough on some of our natural resources, so the resource rent tax or the LNG. So we're one of the cheapest providers of LNG in the world, and people always say, well, you go to Japan, the price is really low. It's actually Australian LNG, and we're not getting any tax. So.
Thank you very much, Tita Matushka. Germany is not doing as well as Australia at the moment. Our national forecast for the GDP has just been halved. In terms of the multiplier effect that you spoke about, the consumers, the spirit among the investors or also business owners, have you observed in your experience of so many years that due to social media, technology, globalization and everything, that these multiplier effects became more intense because people can react quicker, we have more technology to evaluate and consume faster?
You do that, it gives you better information. So let me tell you, in 1990, so I was the head forecaster, so I was responsible for all the government's forecasts in 1990. 6 months after the, quote, recession started, that was the first time I started to have an idea that we were in a recession. Now, these days, I'll give you the complete reverse of that. When COVID first hit, most of you know where Box Hill is, very Chinese suburb in the middle of Melbourne. We saw essentially restaurant sales into Chinese restaurants by Chinese people for 30% in 1 month. So, yeah, we knew we had a problem. So the idea that you just go along and nothing happens, and, you get into AI and things like that, where that, again, you just have to be a bit careful with some of that data. So if I use the Chinese illustration again, Chinese New Year changes, all right? And school holidays change. So you're probably better off looking at the monthly data. But in 1990, we had quarterly data and nothing else. And now we've got, weekly or monthly data. And you can, if something's really big, you can see whether that's happening.
Thanks, Alan. Rob McGuirk. If you're nervous at all about the international financial system with the growth in private equity and the concerns around that, but also AI, I mean, Warren Buffett's index got to 200% recently. That's when he gets nervous. It's gone above that. Is that causing you any concerns as well?
Well, am I worried about the international economy? It's a bit, yes. You may have heard, the IMF's now talking about a recession, but they've got a forecast of 3. Long run average is 3.5. That is not a recession. A recession is like 1. So I think there'll be a worse outcome than people are expecting. I think he's very good at writing things like ads, doing things. No, they are. So, in NAB, we used to find that AI could write a better home loan ad than the marketing department. But my problem is with AI is that it will kill some jobs and people will never, ever be replaced in those areas. But it won't kill the economy unless it kills, essentially, GDP. And there'll be jobs that we won't even think about that will be created, and there'll be extra jobs. And you go back through history, and I always use this one, and I normally get kicked out of the economics department for saying this. Karl Marx, okay? What was his key driver of his theory of communism? Basically, it was that essentially technology and the entrepreneurs would do so well, everybody would be put into unemployment, what's called the Industrial Reserve Army, and therefore it would naturally evolve that the people that were unemployed would revolt, and that would be communism. Never happened. I don't think it ever will. But AI is very dangerous if you just happen to be in the marketing department of NAB, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. Chris Gaspar from the United States, and I'm going to follow up to Adrian's question. I was surprised not to hear national debt as one of your 3 biggest areas of the budget. I believe the United States debt is bigger, payment of debt is now bigger than the defense budget.
No.
And that's approaching $1 trillion if it hasn't cleared it.
Yeah.
What percentage of Australia budget is the national debt retirement?
The national debt is the government debt. As a percent of GDP, it used to be, or I think it was 20 years ago, it was 0. It got to about 16 before COVID, and now it's about 30. Whereas in the US, you were about 90, and I think you're 130, 140% of debt to GDP. So that's the best. So that's the best measure, because it's like saying, you've got $1 million on your credit card, but your house is worth 10. I'm not so worried about that. But, you never know with markets. It's sort of the problem with national debt is it's never a problem until it is a problem. But, but I think basically Australia's much better. So we're at AAA rating. No one's talking about downgrading us.
So please join me in thanking Alan for a wonderful presentation and answering the question. Alan, and a gift for you, 100% Australian made. Thank you. Now, I'd like to thank all of our visiting guests and members from other Rotary clubs that have been with us today, and look forward to seeing you again soon. I'd also like to thank our MC today, Tony Bettini, as well as Robert Fisher, who gave us today's reflection. A reminder that next Wednesday's meeting is an evening meeting, which will be held at our Rotary headquarters just next door, and we'll be discussing Project Rosanna and other peace initiatives led by peace champion Rob McGuirk. Also next week, on Monday, we are starting our monthly volunteering day at Rimmer. We've got a small team of people who've already volunteered to help out on the first Monday of each month. If anyone else is interested in helping out at Rimmer in the warehouse, there's a range of jobs from very simple to a bit more tricky, but we can cater for all sorts of volunteers. Please speak to either John Pebbody or myself, and you're more than welcome to join us. As I said, it'll be on Monday and then the first Monday of each month. The following week, on the 13th of May, we're having a Thomas Baker oration, which we heard a little bit about earlier, with the guest speaker being Professor John Greenwood, the director of the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute. I urge you to register early for that one because it will be a very popular one as well.